Let's talk about back rounding in the deadlift. Why does it happen? Should you do anything about it? And if so, what? So first off, we need to clear up the misconception that back rounding happens in heavier deadlifts because your back is too weak. Now, almost all the time that this happens, it's because your hips cannot handle lifting the weight with any straighter of a spine. What does this mean exactly? Let's break it down. You first need to understand that in a deadlift, you're trying to turn your body into a crane, a human crane. And the fulcrum point of this crane is your hips. And the lever arm of this crane is your spine, from your hips to your shoulders. Now imagine if I were to stretch my spine so that it's twice as long. I'm Mr. Fantastic, and now the distance from my hips to my shoulders goes from here all the way to the edge of this video frame, and that's where the weight is hanging off of. Okay, do you understand how that would make it harder on my hips to lift the weight, even if the weight has not increased one bit? Why? Because the lever arm is longer. It's just going to take more work for my hips to straighten when the lever arm is longer, if the weight were hanging off of here instead of here. And likewise, if my spine were shorter, if the distance from my hips to my shoulders went from here to here instead, and that's where the weight hung off of, then that would make it easier on my hips to do the work. So now you might be asking, what does this have to do with back rounding? Well, look at what happens to the distance between my hips and my shoulders when I round my spine. It decreases. Does that make sense? You're putting two and two together? Back rounding is your body's way of shortening the lever arm so that your hips can do the same amount of work and still get the weight up off the floor. Does that make sense? That's what I mean by back rounding happens in heavier weights, because your hips cannot handle lifting that weight with any straighter of a spine, any longer of a lever arm. Now, should you do anything about this? Well, that's going to then depend on your goals. Are you a competitive powerlifter concerned with getting the most weight up off the floor? Or are you using the deadlift or deadlift variation more as a means of strengthening your hips? Okay, because if it's the former, if your number one priority is to get the most weight up off the floor, then I would argue you'd be foolish to not embrace some amount of back rounding. It's simply going to allow you to lift more weight. And if that's your goal, then embrace it. You might then ask, is it safe to round your back? I would then invite you to look at your back just like you would any other body part. Okay, ask yourself, is it safe to curl 25 pounds? Well, depends. Are you someone who has not done anything strenuous with your body in 10 years and you're going for 25 pounds right off the bat? Or are you someone who has gradually worked up to that weight? Maybe you started at 5 pounds at first and then worked up to 10 pounds, 15 pounds, and now you're at 25. Do you understand how gradually increasing your exposure to that thing you're scared of is a major factor in how safe that thing is? So it's the same with rounding your back. And another thing to consider is, how well are you recovering? I mean, do you know that if you're only sleeping 4 hours a night and you're hungry all the time, you're not feeding yourself properly, that impediment to your recovery is also going to highly increase your likelihood of injury? Okay, so the same principles on how to keep any body part safe applies to your low back as well. Just know that. So that being said, what if you're not a competitive powerlifter? What if you're not really concerned about the number on the bar so much as you are concerned about getting the best stimulus to your hip muscles? Well, in that case, I would argue it might be a better idea to stick only with the heaviest weights that you can deadlift with a more neutral spine. Why? Well, you first have to understand the concept of stimulus to fatigue. Okay. Earlier we established that back rounding happens as a way of decreasing the demands on your hips. Right, so that means that, I'll just put some rough numbers out there, a 250-pound neutral spine deadlift could be having your hips work the same amount as a 300-pound round back deadlift. And you then might ask, well, if they're giving the hips the same amount of work, then what does it matter which one I pick? Good question. Okay. In general, the heavier the weight, the more fatigue it's going to put on your body. And if you've recognized that the 250-pound neutral spine deadlift gives you the same hip stimulus, but less overall fatigue than the 300-pound round back deadlift, then the choice becomes rather simple. You choose the tool that gives you the same stimulus, but less fatigue. Because zooming out, you need sufficient stimulus to be able to get your body to change. But if you can't get that stimulus because the thing you're using to get that stimulus is so fatiguing that you're just hitting the wall of how much fatigue you can handle, that you're not able to get more stimulus, then that's counterproductive. Does that make sense? You want to maximize stimulus and minimize fatigue. And in this case, if the 300-pound round back deadlift is giving the same stimulus but more fatigue than the 250-pound neutral spine deadlift, then the choice becomes simple in this example. Okay, so just to review, why does back rounding happen in heavier deadlifts? It's your body's way of allowing your hips to lift that weight, because your hips in that moment cannot handle lifting the weight with any straighter of a spine, any longer of a lever arm. Should you do anything about this? Well, that depends on your goals. If you're a competitive powerlifter, it may be wiser to embrace some amount of spine rounding because your main concern is the number on the bar. Whereas if your main concern is not the number on the bar, and it's more so how much stimulus you can get on your hips, then choose the option that maximizes stimulus and minimizes fatigue. So that's that. If you found this video useful, please give it a like. Please share it with anyone else who may also find it helpful. If you have any questions about what I covered or have any questions to related topics, please do not hesitate to leave a comment below. And if you want more content on squats and deadlifts and how to approach training from a more first principles approach, I invite you to subscribe. Cheers.